Welcome back, you filthy exiles. So I felt like I'd make a video on this because I'm actually qualified to make a video on this. So this is something that I have worked with within my own professional background to fortify on, and I feel like it's a good thing to talk about. So essentially in the Tavern Talk from yesterday, they confirmed, or Jonathan confirmed, that there was a data breach. Now, there's a thing called data breach and notifiable data breach under Australian law, which basically means that businesses that undergo that process need to openly disclose where you've had a data breach. This can be via the means of a flash drive going missing with sensitive information on it. But essentially, a data breach constitutes personal information being breached en masse by a number of persons or compatriots of your organization, or client data, something of that nature, basically getting out there and being openly accessible. So, what basically was confirmed by Jonathan is this has in fact been the case, and they're going to do a post on this later in the week. And so they were asked this question in the interview. Now, at this stage, they believe only 60 that they know of. They believe only 66 accounts have been compromised in this nature. But there may be more because the way that their logs work, they keep, I believe they keep like a month of logs, something like that, or 7 days of logs. And essentially, before the period to which they actually have log data on, there's 5 days unaccounted for where they just don't keep the retention on the data. And that's perfectly fine because generally, with a lot of like replication and backups and things like that, you don't keep it for longer than a set period. Otherwise, the data hosting becomes too extreme, or the minimum requirements just simply state by law you only need to keep so many days of log data, and then it can be purged because it's no longer relevant to look at. In this case, they're not sure what happened to any other data outside of 66 accounts being accounted for as being affected by the issue. Now, what was the actual issue that occurred? Well, the actual issue in this case was where a help desk operator had a Steam account attached to an old, or their account, an old Steam account attached to their old account. And basically, the external actor managed to get into that Steam account and then basically use the whole password recovery mode and essentially restored the account to be able to access their, maybe what you would call like the admin cPanel through the back end of GGG's system via that Steam account, allowing for them to do some wizardry to do that. I'm not 100% clear on that, and I don't think they're 100% clear on how that's done. Now, the biggest issue with that means that, and this is how I got compromised many moons ago, Steam is just a total weak point to the system. And so, yeah, they're basically going through the process now and purging out any accounts with Steam access or anything like that. So everything is being decoupled and standalone. Arguably, that's a major screw up on their end as well, because they should have probably had better security protocols to be able to manage that. Seems like a really weird oversight for something like an admin account to be attached to a Steam account. But I guess it is a video game company, and as they've scaled up, they didn't really take into account these things. Now, according to them, this is a social engineering attack. So, for anyone who doesn't know what social engineering stands for, it's not a technical breach. So, essentially, you've got a few different ways that you can be breached when in a security breach. So, it isn't someone that's actively hacking their database, is what that means. Basically, the person managed to get in by spoofing details or having enough information to be able to convince Steam that they were from GGG or the original account holder. And so essentially, they managed to get access to the account via like non technical means, if you want to call it that, to be able to get into GGG. Now, social engineering attacks in 2024 and 2025 have become a lot more prevalent, so it is quite hard to defend against social engineering attacks, and it just comes down to good process and training at the end of the day. Ultimately, like, you can only minimize the risk of getting hit with such an attack to a degree, and then you have to rely on the people that work for you to be able to pick up the slack. Now, where does this go with the implementation of MFA? So, essentially, Jonathan's stance on this, and I disagree with this. I think MFA is actually quite easy to implement, and they believe that too. It's just the ability to recover lost accounts or lost passwords. That's the issue they have. Now, for anyone who's dealt in MFA, essentially get a master MFA key, and then you keep that in like 2FS or whatever authenticator program you're using. In the case of GGG, it most likely would be like a 2FS job, right, or Google Authenticator. Now they're concerned about the issue of people being able to regain access to their account should they lose the authenticator. So you change your phone, something like that. I feel like this is a fall down in GGG's ability to be able to manage risk for the player base on this basis, because almost every other company can work with this and get around this. Part of the problem is their help desk and account recovery process is horrific. And I've been there at the butt end of this situation where it's taken like 30 plus emails to get my account back. And that was without an MFA breach scenario or loss of a multi-factor token. So the issue I really see here is one of policy, that they need to really sit down and have a good think about how they do MFA. Now, they've confirmed that they're MFAing all of the internal accounts, which should happen as an organization if they weren't running MFA. That's a little bit immature, like not as in childish, but immature from a organizational standpoint for such a big game dev now. Like, they are a bigger game dev considering they're funded by Tencent, and the fact that essentially, they've made a game that's capped out 1 million players. I'd consider them a bigger game dev. They should have been a lot more on top of this. Now, say whatever you will, Blizzard actually does this really well. Now, they've had issues with, accounts getting hacked and stuff like that, but they can pretty quickly get around and change things and update things. And they've had they used to have a physical token that at some point, at one point, you could order from Blizzard, and then they switched to the Battle.net token and whatnot. Now, this is an area where Blizzard excels at, and it's something that GGG needs to take notes on. If you want to have a bigger game, you've got to have a more secure system to be able to protect the player base as best you can. Now, you can never remove the risk. There's always the risk of getting compromised. There's always the risk of getting breached. There's always the risk of social engineering, but you can reduce it to an acceptable minimal level. And this is where I sort of think that Jonathan has a lot to learn and grow around this area, and they need to stop thinking like a small game dev or an indie game dev, and they need to really think about what they need to do to bring their systems up to enterprise level. Simplistically, my standpoint would be to have MFA on every single account, irrespective of what the recovery process is, and build a recovery process that's amicable for the player base, that does not necessarily require the intervention of help desk. So you would link it to email accounts and recovery emails and things like that, similar to what Google does. And then essentially, you would have an authenticator token when you log in, which isn't necessarily the greatest thing in the world, because you're going to have an auth token. But if you don't want to go to that extreme, there has to be something in place. Not, we don't want to do it because of a recovery of account issue that may or may not happen. That feels like almost like an excuse to say, oh, they just don't want to do it because it's not convenient. At this stage, they've had 66 accounts breached, and it doesn't matter what they say. It's always risk that it's going to happen again if they don't significantly upend and change their processes, because that's, 66 accounts too many that got breached, in my opinion. I don't recall of any recent times where Blizzard or any company like that has been breached to such a nature. So there's definitely some big changes that need to come from this, and hopefully they eventually roll out MFA and or something that takes the form of something similar. They basically just need to get over their own hurdle, and they need to come up with a solution, because if people are going to invest money and time into accounts and their product, they need to secure that product reasonably for the market as an overall and the player base, to be able to protect the player base from another instance of a data breach of this nature. So anyway, in summary, there's a lot of things that need to happen to secure things, but it was a social engineering attack and relatively benign on a technical level. I do feel for the people who got compromised. I've been there as well in the past. It's not a great feel. It's not a link to any actual external application. So apps, things like that, like, you know, your trade apps and things like that aren't affecting it, the situation. So if you thought that might be the case, that isn't the case, at least from what we can see in this circumstance. So, you know, apply your loot filters to your heart's content. It's got nothing to do with whether or not your account will get compromised from what we can see. Anyway, if you like this type of video, don't forget to like and sub to the channel. Also, there's the Twitch down below in the description and whatnot. And I will see you guys in the next video.